America's western public lands are a cherished national treasure. Alpine meadows, dense forests, sagebrush seas, endless grasslands, free-flowing rivers, and dry deserts. In many ways, our vast wild western landscape are what define us as a nation, to ourselves and to the rest of the world. 42% of the United States west of the 100th meridian is federal public land. That's 390 million acres owned by all Americans. This includes our national parks, national wildlife refuges, national forests, national grasslands, and the vast lands of the Bureau of Land Management. These lands belong to all of us. They contain watersheds that supply drinking water for millions of Americans, habitat for hundreds of threatened, endangered, and sensitive species, and recreation areas enjoyed by millions of people from around the world. Many people have heard of some of the threats to these landscapes: logging, clear cuts, and roads, and ever-increasing oil and gas drilling. But what many people don't know is that private livestock production occurs on the vast majority of these lands. In fact, livestock grazing occurs on more public land than any other commercial use. About 70% of our national forests, national grasslands, and BLM lands are grazed. That's more than 250 million acres, an area the size of Texas plus California. Livestock grazing even occurs on many national wildlife refuges and in some national parks as well. No other human activity in the West is as responsible for the loss of wildlife as livestock production, which has contributed to the decline of 22% of all threatened and endangered species, almost as much as logging and mining combined. Livestock production affects public lands in many significant ways, from killing of wildlife to water diversions, and mile after mile of fencing. Livestock production threatens wildlife and habitat on our public lands. The Sierra Club prioritizes the protection and restoration of wildlife habitat on our public lands, including reducing the impacts of livestock production. In some locations, this may require changes or reductions of livestock grazing management. In some areas, livestock production may need to end in order for the land and wildlife to recover. Our challenge is to address these problems in ways that the majority of people, as well as our elected decision-makers, will accept. This means finding ways that also benefit the people involved. Let's look at some of the impacts of livestock production in more detail. One impact is water pollution. Poorly managed livestock grazing is a major cause of degraded streams. Livestock prefer to remain very close to water sources, and this leads to water pollution in two ways. First, by trampling the stream banks and eating the vegetation that holds the stream banks together, and by defecating in streams and lakes, which spreads waterborne diseases to our water supply. Thousands of rivers, lakes, streams, springs, and seeps are diverted for livestock. This can destroy wetlands and change water quality and quantity on our public lands. A second impact of livestock grazing is the decline or loss of fish populations. More than 4/5 of the West's native fish populations are either listed or candidates for listing under the Endangered Species Act. Livestock is a major reason. Water diversions for livestock reduce water flows and block fish movement. Livestock grazing also often causes streams to widen, filling waterways with sediment and raising the water temperature. This makes streams less attractive or even uninhabitable to many native fish, and often gives exotic fish a competitive advantage. A third impact of livestock grazing is wildlife habitat degradation. Livestock eat vegetation. On most public lands in the West, federal officials allocate more forage to livestock than to all native wildlife combined. livestock remove much of the vegetation that otherwise would be available to wildlife, such as elk, bison, and pronghorn. Livestock damage riparian areas. In the West's arid climate, the lush riparian areas found near water are critical habitat for native wildlife, providing essential habitat for 75 to 80% of all western species. Damage to riparian habitats due to livestock grazing has dramatically reduced the habitat of songbirds such as this southwest willow flycatcher. Fences are a fourth impact of livestock production. Tens of thousands of miles of fences clutter our public lands. Fences have incredible negative impacts on wildlife, including acting as barriers to migration, causing death from wildlife collisions, and increasing predation on birds like sage-grouse, which avoid fenced areas because predators perch on the fence posts. A fifth impact of livestock grazing is the spread of disease. Livestock can transmit exotic diseases to wildlife. For example, lungworm from domestic sheep has devastated bighorn sheep herds throughout the West. And livestock have spread brucellosis to the wild bison of Yellowstone National Park and to elk across the West as well. Sixth, livestock spread weeds across the West. Livestock spread exotic weeds through excreting the non-native seeds and by eating native plants, which then gives a competitive advantage to the weedy species. Entire landscapes have been converted to non-native plants. This affects a long list of wildlife. The BLM land in this photo was purposefully converted to non-native plants for the benefit of livestock, but to the great detriment of wildlife and native vegetation. Often, the impacts of weeds on a landscape, such as this one, is not apparent to the untrained eye, and may even look lush and beautiful, but the damage is very real. A seventh impact is direct wildlife eradication. Historically, wolves, grizzly bears, and bison were eliminated by shooting, trapping, and poisoning, in large part to keep livestock safe. Millions of acres of prairie dogs, well over 95% of their total populations, were poisoned with federal funds in the early 1900s. Many other species that benefited from the presence of wolves, grizzlies, bison, or prairie dogs were devastated as a result, including the black-footed ferret, swift fox, burrowing owls, mountain plovers, hawks, and even the American burying beetle, just to name a few. Today, recovery of wildlife is hindered by the presence of livestock. For example, wild bison are not allowed to roam public lands due to the ubiquitous presence of cattle, with only two exceptions, Utah's Henry Mountains and Yellowstone National Park. And even the Yellowstone bison are persecuted and often killed when they leave the park boundaries. And the wildlife killing continues to this day. Hundreds of thousands of animals are killed each year with federal funds, much of it on our public lands, solely for the perceived benefits to livestock, often with little or no evidence of those alleged benefits. Federally funded predator killing and prairie dog poisoning cost taxpayers about $10 million a year. Black bears, badgers, bobcats, cougars, foxes, and especially coyotes are persecuted at phenomenal levels, about 100,000 each year with federal dollars on federal lands. And thousands of acres of prairie dogs continue to be poisoned and shot on public lands to leave more grass for the livestock, even in areas critical for endangered species that depend on prairie dogs, such as the black-footed ferret. Conflicts with recreation is another impact of livestock production. Water pollution from livestock has obvious impacts on river and lake recreation. Wildlife viewing, birding, hunting, and fishing are all impacted by fewer wildlife and degraded habitats. Miles and miles of fences interfere with freedom to hike across open public lands. In many areas, hikers and campers must obey strict rules to prevent polluting water sources and impacting the landscape. Meanwhile, livestock degrade those very same water sources and landscapes. Nearly all surface waters in the West, Even many clear-looking streams are fouled with livestock waste that produce harmful waterborne bacteria and protozoa such as Giardia. And finally, livestock grazing on public lands impacts all taxpayers. Taxpayers subsidize this destruction. Each year, we lose at least $124 million on Forest Service and BLM range management programs. Many additional costs not counted by these agencies bring the total to over $500 million per year. This grazing program benefits only 3% of all livestock producers in the United States, 22,000 ranchers. Besides wasting taxpayers' money, these subsidies place the other 97% of ranchers at an economic disadvantage. In the arid West, one cow may require more than 250 acres of land per year, while in the moist Mideast or eastern United States, an acre or two may be all that's required. This is one reason why, despite the huge amount of land devoted to livestock production, Western federal lands feed only 2 to 3% of the nation's livestock. Many other hidden expenses are also left to the taxpayer. These include costs of recovering threatened and endangered species that have been impacted by livestock grazing, mitigation for soil erosion, and weed control. Whether you're a bird watcher, kayaker, hunter, fisher, hiker, or a taxpayer who never sets foot on federal lands, livestock production on our federal lands affects you. The Sierra Club is working on solutions to livestock production impacts on our public lands. Our solutions will save taxpayers money, save wildlife, save recreation opportunities, and even help public lands ranchers who are now struggling financially. The Sierra Club's livestock grazing policy calls for ending commercial grazing on federal public lands under 5 circumstances that severely degrade public lands and wildlife. The first circumstance is federal lands that receive 12 inches or less average annual precipitation. The Sierra Club Grazing Committee has identified and mapped these public lands. This map shows that 37%, or 143 million acres out of all the western federal land, falls within this arid category. $258 million acres of BLM, national grassland, and national forest are open to livestock grazing. When the aridity of these lands are considered, we see where we should place our priorities to reform public land grazing. The areas in red on this map are the 97 million acres of BLM grasslands and forest lands open to livestock grazing that also receive less than 12 inches mean annual precipitation. We've also produced maps for each state. This map of California shows where we should prioritize our efforts, once again shown in red. We've taken the step of identifying where to begin working. Now we just need to get the job done. The Sierra Club is providing information to people on the impacts of livestock grazing production and the value of ecological restoration. We're working to change poor livestock grazing management on federal public lands by promoting science-based management on our forests, national parks, wildlife refuges, and any other areas of special significance. We promote replacing non-native grazers such as cattle, sheep, and goats with the wild native herbivores within their historic range. The best options may be those that benefit the people involved. The Sierra Club has endorsed voluntary grazing permit retirement for public lands ranchers where the conflicts are most severe. If implemented, this would allow public land ranchers to take a one-time payment in return for closing grazing allotments to livestock. This would aid the recovery of the arid land's delicate vegetation and wildlife, and help struggling ranchers in arid areas where livestock grazing makes less and less economic sense. The Sierra Club is committed to developing partnerships with community members to identify and implement strategies to both protect traditional communities as well as the ecological integrity of the public lands without sacrificing either. You can help. Participate in public land management by adding your comments during planning processes. Check in with your local Sierra Club group or chapter for more information. Write to your legislators about problems with commercial livestock grazing on public lands. Visit our public lands and learn about these issues firsthand. The Sierra Club leads numerous hikes on public lands across the country. Finally, see our website at www.sierraclub.org/grazing for more information, literature citations, details on the Sierra Club's grazing policy, and links to contact the Sierra Club Grazing Committee.